to the Log Cabin Chronicles. This first one talks about the foundation of the St. Louis province with its antecedents. And so we did it. We put this together first for September 12th of 2016, which was the 180th anniversary of our arrival here. So here we have a lovely picture of our first log cabin. We're going to talk about our story, which of course is to do and to be anything of which a woman is capable to serve the dear neighbor. And how did it begin? Well, of course we know it began in France with a Jesuit missionary, Father Jean-Pierre Médaille, traveling the countryside, trying to get people back into the faith and meeting people who got on fire with his mission. Now, probably some of those people became Jesuits, but there were women who wanted to do something for others, who probably couldn't afford and also didn't want to be traditional nuns. And so they came together. In 1650, they came together, some of them before that, some of them after, but 1650 was the official coming together under Bishop Henri de Maupas, who authorized François Hérault, Claudia Chastel, Marguerite Boudier, Anna Chelayer, Anna Vey, and Anna Brun to form a group, what became a new congregation, the Sisters of St. Joseph. They were simple peasant women. And that movement grew from 1650, multiple communities, most of them individual foundations, through the countryside in the Diocese of Le Puy and multiple surrounding dioceses, probably all the way to Lyon. All went well, all grew until the time of the French Revolution. And at the French Revolution, we got the person who's underneath our story, Mother St. John Fanpin. She was born in a little town called Basse-en-Bassée in 1759. As a young girl, may have studied in Le Puy, certainly studied some in Monistrol, where her aunt was the superior of a convent of Sisters of St. Joseph. Jean and her sister decided that they too would like to be Sisters of St. Joseph. And her loving aunt told them it was entirely too difficult a life for them. They'd never make it, which only made them stronger in their desire to do it. So they did decide to enter, two of them together, and just before, or just at the time that they were entering, the Bishop of Le Puy asked the aunt to open a new convent in the town of Monistrol, a full 6 or 8 kilometers from Basse, which means 3 or 4 miles. They went there, and Jean Fanpin became Sister St. Jean Fanpin, and before long became superior of the convent because the bishop had promised that her aunt could return to the convent in Basse. And so Mother St. John became the superior of the house there, elected, as the story says. She was there until the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, the convents were closed. Now, there's a long history about how all of this happened. But the revolution was very anti-clerical. The church was very aligned with the wealthy. And so little by little, everything was closed down. Now, when sisters were no longer allowed to have hospitals or schools, Mother St. John and her sister and one other sister stopped acting like sisters and continued to serve until that ruse was finally uncovered. And they had to leave the convent in Monistrol and return home to Basse. At that time, they were in hiding or at home, also hiding priests who snuck around to celebrate the Eucharist with the faithful. One day when the soldiers came to search their house, there was a priest hiding in the house, and so rather than have the house be searched, Mother St. John and some others gave themselves up and were taken to prison, where they were expected to soon be transferred to Le Puy, where they would meet the guillotine. The guillotine didn't operate in every town, just some special places, and Le Puy was one of them.
Yeah.
But the day before they were to be transferred, which was the day before they assumed that they would die, Robespierre fell. And they got out of prison, but we're not exactly sure what their date of getting out of prison was. Anyway, Mother St. John, in this mysterious way, returns home to her little town in Bassin-Bassé. She lives in the house with her sister. Presumably, her aunt reinstituted the convent in the town. It's not real clear about this. Mother St. John tried to get back the property at Monistrol, but was unable to because a revolutionary had purchased it and would not sell back to nuns, that was for sure. So she couldn't return to her convent, didn't return to any other. We know that some were starting up again or had never even been really shut down. But she stayed at home until 1808, when a number of things came together. By then, there was a new government going on. Napoleon had come to power. Napoleon had an uncle who was a cardinal, Fesch. Cardinal Fesch became the Cardinal Archbishop of Lyon. He wanted a priest, Father Choleton, to be his vicar. Now, Choleton was one of those who, during the Revolution, had been exiled, came back, and he started a community of women that he wanted to be among the most austere possible. The Black Sisters, they were called. They didn't exactly wear a habit, but such a costume that he was delighted to think that people would make fun of them. You know, all of this kind of penance of looking terrible, real self-imposed penances is what he was bringing these people up in. Now, I'm not sure that he lived exactly that way himself, but it was his vision for their religious life. When he was called to go from Saint-Étienne, where he had this community, to Lyon, which was from one fairly decent-sized city to the second largest city in France, he didn't want to leave this community. What was he going to do with it? This odd convergence of circumstances happens when a father, I think his name was Hubert, a Franciscan, who had been sometime in Monistrol, happens to be in Lyon, happens to know that Choleton has this question about his sisters, happens to be in a meeting with Choleton and Cardinal Fesch and says, I think I know who could do that. I think that Sister Jeanne Frampin, who hasn't returned to her own, who hasn't been able to get back her own convent, could take over your sisters in Saint-Étienne. So they send to Bas and ask Sister Jeanne Frampin if she will come and take over this group. Now, I don't know too much about what all happened or how she made her decision, but we do have the anecdote that when the cardinal's messengers arrive at the home, Mother St. John's mother says, you don't want her. She's not got any kind of good judgment. Just let her stay here, there'll be less trouble. Well, it didn't work that way. Mother St. John accepted that invitation for reasons she's never really told us about. Went to Saint-Étienne, began to work with that community. There was another small community that may have been under the same influence of Father Choleton, who came together and joined her there as well. And things began to grow. One of those people, who I think we'll mention in a minute, was Mother St. John Marcoux. Sister St. John Marcoux was one of the sisters who joined Mother St. John in Saint-Étienne. And as early as 1812, there was a request for sisters in Chambéry, which is a city further east of Lyon. So Mother St. John Frampin sends this her most trusted protege, Mother St. John or sister at that time, Saint John Marcoux, to found a community that ends up being the congregation of Chambéry. By 1814, they have moved to Lyon because their community has grown such that they need more space. And so we see, this is what grew from Mother St. John and the beginnings, the rebirth in Lyon. Some of these communities came directly out of Le Puy. Saint-Vallier, which is now has a congregational center in Canada. The Institute of St. Joseph is the grouping that came together, and Le Puy, the Le Puy congregation is included in it. That Le Puy founded St. Augustine, Florida, which also founded in Puerto Rico. But the rest of these, well, Notre Dame de Chambéry, which is a different story. The rest of these all came out of Lyon and Mother St. John Fontaine. This is Mother St. John Marcoux, who founded Chambéry in 1812, and eventually a community in Saint-Jean-de-Maurienne, which became the mother founding community of our Sisters of St. Joseph of Buenos Aires, and the community in Moutier, to which Carondelet owes a great thanks, about which we'll hear later. Here's the mother house, built by Mother St. John in beginning in 1814. Now we probably also know the anecdote that when she had it finished, a vicar, not Choleton, said the windows were too big. It was vain to have such a luxurious place, and the novices could not move there. So they had to stay in the place that they had been next door, sort of, until a new priest was appointed, and they moved into the house just as it should have been. Now, this is the house out of which our first missionaries came. A large house, large windows. In Lyon, the average low temperature in the winter is about 32 degrees. The average high is about 81.
Oh.
I'm saying this because these sisters were coming to St. Louis, where the average low is maybe 24 degrees in January, which makes the difference between ice and no ice. And the average high, 89 in July, and it seems much more than that in St. Louis. In 1840, the population of Lyon was 180,000. The population of St. Louis was 16,500. This is the leap, part of the leap that these sisters are making. How did it happen? What were the connections that made all of this fall together? Well, first of all, as we've said, there was Mother St. John Fontaine. There was a family named Charbonnet, and they'll come up again later. The Charbonnels were wealthy people in Monistrol, and during the time that Mother St. John was superior in Monistrol, the Charbonnel family helped her with her projects. There were the Choletons, the Father Choleton of whom we just spoke, who founded the Black Sisters, and his nephew, who became the vicar or the representative of Bishop Joseph Rosati in St. Louis. He was, Father Choleton in Lyon, was the one who spoke on behalf of Rosati to the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, which had been founded in Lyon. There was also the Countess Félicité de Rochacalin, a very wealthy, very pious woman who wanted to do good works and who had read the annals of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. This was kind of the Maryknoll magazine of the day. The Society for the Propagation of the Faith was founded by a young girl, Pauline Jaricot, whose brother was a seminarian, wrote her letters about what the missionaries suffered. Well, Pauline belonged to a card-playing group, and they used to pitch in a penny per game, and the pot goes to the winner. Well, she thought, we could do this for money for the missions. So everybody would pay a penny. And then if we get 10 people to do this, she set up a pyramid scheme, basically. We get 10 people to do this, we'll get 10, each one of those 10 has to get 10 more, each one of those 10 has to get 10 more, and pretty soon they were collecting sizable amounts of money. At first, it got the jealousy of some of the church who said, this young girl shouldn't be doing this, we don't know what she's doing with those funds. And when they saw what a success it was, they said, we'll call it the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. And it became official. Anyway, this is the stuff that was going on in those days. All these interesting, unexpected connections. Then we get, oh, here we have our friends. Oh, yeah. Up in the upper left is a young picture of Bishop Rosati. When I can find young pictures of these guys, it's always nicer, because life on the frontier did not do them a lot of good. Over here, a young picture of the Countess, Rose Jacqueline. Of course, Mother St. John Fontbonne, and a person who was in on a lot of this was the Curé of Ars, St. John Vianney. He was a dear friend of Mother St. John's, someone to whom she turned for advice, and obviously a bit of an influence in that whole area at that time. And so, we come to St. Louis. Bishop Giuseppe Rosati, or Joseph, is easier for us to say, of Vincentian. He had connections with the Society for the Propagation of the Faith in Lyon. But before he ever got to the United States, he was an Italian Vincentian who was kind of enticed to the idea of being a missionary to the United States by Bishop Dubourg. Now, Dubourg was a well-to-do, a good background Frenchman who was recruiting as much as he could in Italy. So Dubourg recruits Rosati. Dubourg had been at one point at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore as the rector. He ran the seminary kind of into debt. But during that time, he was also a good friend of Mother Seton and a teacher to some of her children. But when he gets out to be Bishop of New Orleans, or the Louisiana Territory, he's recruited Rosati. He barely gets Rosati named his auxiliary, or his coadjutor, when he has to go back to France. And it just seems an apropos time to resign. So he resigns, leaving Rosati with this huge diocese. And eventually Dubourg gets another diocese in Europe. But Rosati becomes Bishop of St. Louis in 1827. And of course, in about 1834-35, he starts getting communications from the Countess Rose Jacqueline. At that time, this was not such a sister poor diocese. Rosati had the Religious of the Sacred Heart, the Sisters of Loretto, and the Daughters of Charity, at least. And a couple of them had more than one place. So what did he want? He wanted priests, is what he wanted. He wanted priests and he wanted money to continue to build the churches and so on that he needed. But he's got these communications from the Countess. And for some reason, somebody sees a need for deaf education. It's hard to figure out exactly what that need was. When our sisters first arrived, there weren't a lot of deaf children wandering around looking for teachers. The first child who came to St. Joseph's Institute came from a fair distance away. My guess about deaf education is that the Protestants had started it. What was Gallaudet University is now Gallaudet University. That movement had begun. They had learned the techniques of deaf education from a French priest, a priest in Paris, who was the one who kind of put together the whole concept of sign language and teaching of the deaf. Now, for the Protestants, teaching the deaf would have had a unique importance, because if you remember, you are saved by the Word. You have to know Scripture. And if you are not verbal, you are not literate, and you don't know Scripture. Catholics, we can baptize them and they're fine. But the Protestants had started this move for deaf education. And my guess is the Catholics wanted to pick up on it before they lost all of their deaf people to Protestant schools. So there was a question about the need for deaf education. Rosati, the Countess, Father Choleton, all comes together. Mother St. John is asked if she will send missionaries. As the story goes, she offered to her sisters the opportunity to volunteer. And there were multiple volunteers. When it came time for the council meeting to decide who would go, Mother St. John absented herself from the meeting, lest she have any prejudices of deciding who would and who would not go. So we have, on January 17th, 1836, 6 sisters and 1 priest that we know get on a boat. This is quite fun because it's really the manifest that shows the names of the passengers, including people like Miss Antoinette Fontaine, Miss M.A. Fontaine, Miss Maria Chapillon, and so on, who are listed in their age is there, their gender, and their occupation. It's none, as in N-U-N, not N-O-N-E. So that's really the manifest from their boat trip. They spent 47 days from Le Havre at the northern part of France until they arrived at the port of New Orleans, and then would arrive in St. Louis on March 25th. Now, who were these people? First of all, 2 named Fabroni, Fabroni Chapillon and Fabroni Fontaine. Sister Fabroni Fontaine was named the superior of the group. Well, she was old, she was 29. She had entered the congregation at the age of 14 and had been, before coming, a novice director. She returned to France in 1844 due to illness, but she did all right. She didn't die until 1881 at the age of 75. Sister Delphine Fontaine, the younger sister. She was born in 1813, 7 years younger than Fabroni. Delphine came and was named first superior at Carondelet. And some guess that perhaps she was named superior more for her last name than for the qualities that really prepared her for that work. She had a hard time of it, I think. She was superior here until 1839, when Bishop Rosati named Sister Celestine as her successor. She went to study English for a while after being superior with the Religious of the Sacred Heart. She also taught around the St. Louis area until 1850, when she went to Philadelphia to help Sister St. John Fournier, who was overwhelmed at the time. In 1851, the same year that we founded our province in St. Paul, Bishop Charbonnel, son of that Charbonnel family in Monistrol, was named Bishop of Toronto. He came to America, passes through Philadelphia, and finds out that there's a Sister of St. Joseph, Fontaine, there, comes to visit the Sisters of St. Joseph and says, wouldn't you come and found in Toronto. And so Delphine Fontaine goes to Toronto, where she founds the congregation in that country and becomes a very beloved superior and is honored by them as what they call a martyr of charity. She nursed people in a cholera epidemic and succumbed to it herself, dying in 1856. Sister Félicité Boutet, born in 1804, so she wasn't that young. She was maybe actually the oldest of the group, 32. Made vows in 1827. In her missions, she was an infirmarian. She worked in the orphanages. She was a general counselor. She was a teacher. And she died at Nazareth Convent at the age of 77 in 1881. One of the things we know about her from the letters of the girls who studied at St. Joseph's Academy was that she was handy with the saw. She sawed boards so that they could make sleds. Now you can imagine, those who know Carondelet, going down that bluff toward the river on your hand-sawn board sled. But that was Félicité Boutet. Sister Saint Protes de Bois. Saint Protes was a novice when she came, and became one of our greatest chroniclers. It wasn't until 1892 when Sister Monica Corrigan of the Trek of the Seven Sisters fame started to gather the history and asked different sisters who had known our history well, who had been part of the beginnings. Monica Corrigan asked them to write about their memoirs and what went on. St. Protes has a wonderful long letter that begins with their leaving Lyon and trying to sneak off so Mother St. John Fonfon doesn't have to have that last final goodbye, and the adventures on the boat and everything in between. So St. Protes is one of our great chroniclers who had a lot of movement and a lot of adventure in her life. We'll hear about her significantly again when we go to St. Paul. Sister Philomene is the only one of those first of whom we have no picture. So this is our stock picture of Sister who we don't know what she looked like. She received the habit the day before they departed for the United States. So she was another one of the novices. You know, in a sense, 3 sisters brought a novitiate over to Carondelet because there were 3 novices. Philomene made her vows at St. Mary and Joseph's Church on the 3rd of January of 1838. One of her early missions was in Cahokia. When Sister St. Protes got sick in Cahokia, Philomene went there to take her place. She also was missioned in Carondelet. She was part of the founding group of St. Paul. She was a superior in St. Paul. And in 1860, she returned to St. Louis. She died in 1861 at the age of 50. We've gotten Sister St. Protes. Sister Celestine Pomerel. Celestine was one of the 2 who was chosen to be sent to Saint Etienne, the city where Mother St. John had started, to study deaf education before coming to America. So she had entered the congregation in 1831 at the age of 18. At the age of 24, she came to the United States with her cousin, Sister St. John Fournier. And we will talk more about Sister St. John Fournier in a minute or 2. These are the ones who came to the Diocese of St. Louis. That cathedral had just been completed when our sisters arrived. It was completed in 1833. Sister St. Protes' letter, Sister St. Protes wrote a lot, but her English was less than perfect. When they arrived, the bishop was in hope that he had been in time to say Mass, but it was too late. They go first to the cathedral to thank God for their happy voyage. Imagine.
47 days.
47 days on the ocean. They left in January. This was March 25th when they arrived in St. Louis, which happened to be the Friday before the beginning of Holy Week. Then the bishop sent them to the Sisters of St. Vincent Hospital. The sisters put them in a little house that they had on 3rd Street at the end of their garden. We got hospitality from a number of sisters. In New Orleans, it was the Ursulines who received us. Here in St. Louis, it was the Sisters of Charity who started. Now, interestingly, I don't know how many Sisters of Charity there were here at the time, but they had this house downtown, and on that very day, they had a small log cabin in the little town of Carondelet, where they were living. They had some orphans there, and the wealthy Melanphy family was in the process of building them a building that would be a better orphanage. And so they vacated that building a few months before the Sisters of St. Joseph received it at Carondelet. So here we are. September 12th, 1836. The sisters arrived. At that log cabin. Now remember the picture of the mother house and the oven? Mm-hmm. This is a bit of a switch. I've been trying to get more information about various things. There was certainly no indoor plumbing. Where the well was, I don't know. Clearly, to get upstairs, they had to use the ladder on the outside. They did it though. Sisters, they didn't arrive here until September, but actually, shortly after Easter, the three sisters were sent over to Cahokia, where they began a mission among French trapping families, people who spoke their language, people who had been around for a while, people who were involved in a trade that allowed them to support their church and to have a school built that the sisters could take over. It was probably not well-to-do, but a far cry from that log cabin. So they began their work, and in the meantime, they've got two sisters back there in Saint-Étienne studying deaf education, who take off, and they've been told here in Carondelet that the sisters are on their way, and they didn't show, and they didn't show. It finally turned out that they began to worry that they had been lost at sea, or, as Bishop Rosati said, maybe they had run off with the soldiers. But they arrived in September of 1837, just a little less than a year after the sisters first arrived at Carondelet. Now this is Mother St. John Fournier telling this tale. She was one of the two. She was a novice at the time that they came, and she was apparently the cousin to Sister Celestine with whom she came. So she says, when they arrived in St. Louis, the bishop, in telling us he did not want us to lose our rosy cheeks, had not told us the real reason why he was keeping us in St. Louis. The poor house was too small. He was having it raised one story, and there was no roof, but the weather was good. They brought some mattresses. This is a little, once they got out here, the sisters brought some mattresses, which we stretched out on the floor and tried to take a little rest. It began to rain, and they got wet. But in that situation where they were, she says, alas, who could sleep with rats, mice, and numberless little insects, not only as companions, but walking over us all night, and for 10 or 12 nights in succession. The house was finally covered with a roof, and we left our famished companions to fend for themselves as best they could. The following week, the bishop brought us a little deaf-mute girl. Now the sisters arrived here first on September 12th, 1836, and they opened school 1 week later. Same kind of thing happened there. How was life at Carondelet? Things were tough, really. First of all, this was an area not well settled. This was outside of St. Louis. It wasn't any suburb. It was a town 6 miles from St. Louis. The people were rough and tumble. As Sister St. Protes said in her letter, they were too poor to even have time to think of religion. They were woodcutters. So they cutting down the trees and carting the wood into St. Louis to sell it. The river was a problem, particularly for the sisters who lived in Cahokia, because it continually overflowed and not only flooded them, but also created situations in which there was a lot of sickness. So that river, in the situation that would have been the better one, kept them from being able to make a stable, long-term settlement. On this side of the river, there was rigidity. Sister Delphine Fontbonne, 24 years old, superior, has at least one novice with her. What is she to do? She walks by the rule. Everything must be by the rule. And her brother Jean, or Jacques, was very much at her side in that. He was named the ecclesiastical superior of the sisters. At one point, it looked like the sisters had more superiors than sisters, because there was Delphine and Fabroni were both superiors. Jacques Fontbonne was their ecclesiastical superior. They had the pastor of the parish here, the pastor of the parish in Cahokia, and the bishop. You know, this was something that Father Madai tried to avoid. But there was rigidity, there was sickness, and particularly on the Carondelet side of the river, there was poverty. In spite of that, they grew. The first new members came. The first one, born in the area of St. Charles, Missouri, Anne Eliza Dillon. Her father was a wealthy Irish landholder, and her mother died when Anne Eliza was a little child. She and her sister attended the Academy of the Ladies of the Sacred Heart, and that was where they met our sisters. Our sisters were studying English with the Sisters of the Sacred Heart. Anne Eliza entered the community and did write to Bishop Rosati, saying life was a little tough under Mother Delphine Fontbonne. She wanted her to work too much, she thought. She said she didn't enter the community basically to be a workhorse, but rather to love God. And she said, she tells me that it is a privilege to be able to teach English since I'm just a novice. Well, privilege or no, there was nobody else who could have taught anything in English at that point. You know, these were French sisters. And there was probably, if you had an insecure and by-the-book superior, a sister, young sister coming from a family that was well enough to do, a family that had good connections, a sister who could manage quite well because her English was excellent, could have been a bit of a threat. Anyway, Anne Eliza made it, and unfortunately, one day they say it was in the traveling between Cahokia and Carondelet. She caught a cold, and as very often happened in those days, the cold turned to consumption, and she died in 1842. Then Elizabeth Marsteller entered the congregation, became Sister Mary Rose. Now look at this. She was born in 1810 and was received in 1842. Receiving women who were not 18 years old is not a brand new thing in this congregation. She made vows in 1844 and lived until, she made vows in 1844 and lived until 1884. So she lived a fine life. Maria Kincaid, also from this area of St. Louis, born in 1822, received in 1842. So she was 20 years old. She died in 1848. Life was tough here on the frontier. There's kind of a lovely thing from Eliza Dillon, Sister Mary Joseph Dillon's necrology. It says, the deceased was a native of St. Louis, Missouri, was the first who entered the novitiate, which was then established and had nothing to recommend it to a votary of religion except the most rigid poverty. Although the child of affluence, Sister Mary Joseph was not the least daunted to leave the convenience and comforts of home for the log cabin of Carondelet. In that, she probably really shared something with those first missionaries, who left pretty decent places to come here. Nor did she consider that she made any sacrifice in doing so, too happy to be permitted to aspire to the practice of the evangelical counsels. She applied herself with all assiduity to the study of our rules and with exceedingly great fervor perfected herself in the Spirit after a short time. So it's a hard start, but it's a real start. Then the first mission outside of Carondelet, or the Cahokia mission. Sister St. John Fournier writes, in the year 1843 or 44, the first mission was opened in St. Louis as a school for liberated Negroes. Obedience sent me there with 2 other sisters. We also prepared slaves for the reception of the sacraments, and this displeased the whites very much. After some time, they threatened to have us put out by force. The threats were repeated every day. Finally, one morning as I was leaving the church, several people called out to me and told me that they were coming that night to put us out of the house. I said nothing to the sisters and was not afraid. So great confidence had I in the Blessed Virgin. I put some miraculous medals on the entrance gate and on the fences. We already had them in all the doors and windows of the house. Nevertheless, at 11 o'clock at night, the sisters woke with a start. Out in the street was a crowd of people crying out and cursing. We recited together the Memorare and other prayers. Suddenly, the police patrol came and scattered those villains who were trying to break down the door. They returned 3 times that same night, but our good mother protected us, and they were not able to open the door from the outside nor to break it down. Now, our good mother protected us. I think probably the police had something to do with it too. So she says about that school, we had about 80 children, all good and well-behaved. Well-behaved, I think, because there were about 20 little boys out of the 80. So they had enough calming influence. And they were already making fine progress. I believe we had been there a year and a half or 2 years, says Sister St. John Fournier in the 1870s. I scarcely remember any date, but the dates must all be at Carondelet, which is an unfortunate thing to say, because in 1856, there was a fire at Carondelet, which may have destroyed an awful lot of our very early records.
1858.
1858. So Carondelet didn't have the records. The day after our adventure, the mayor of St. Louis advised Bishop Kenrick to close that school for a time, and he did so. So the first mission outside was to the freed slaves and children of African Americans. The situation, this is what it was like at the time. This 1860s poster advertises the danger of encouraging laziness through education. Now, Mother St. John Fournier, the one who came as a novice, has quite a story. She was born in 1814. She went away a significant distance from home to enter a religious community. She entered the community of the Immaculate Conception, which was a cloistered contemplative community. She made vows in 1832. In those days, vows were vows. It wasn't first and then final. Vows were vows. So she made vows in 1832. Somehow hears on the grapevine that the Countess has something to do with sending some missionaries to America. And it's the Sisters of St. Joseph. And she transfers congregations, which is a pretty interesting story in those days. And if canon law was then anything like it was until more recently, she was coming down in the world to leave a contemplative community and join an apostolic community. But she wanted to be a missionary. She was one of those with that great missionary fervor. And so she was received into the community and sent to Saint Etienne to study deaf education. And the person who sponsored that study was the Countess Rochatelin. Sister St. John Fournier came to America as a novice sister of St. Joseph. Final vows as a sister of the Immaculate Conception. She apparently had some health problems, which is not surprising, coming from France to the United States to this kind of an atmosphere. And that was one of the reasons why Bishop Rosati kept postponing her vows. But she did finally make vows on December 27th, 1838. And then was part of one of the new adventures. Our first mission outside of this area was, as they always say, go east, go east. Philadelphia. How is it that the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in St. Louis ended up going east as their first mission venture? Well, by now, Bishop Rosati had been in Rome. He was looking for a coadjutor, somebody to help him. And his eye lit on Peter Richard Kenrick, an Irish missionary who had been in the eastern part of the United States, but had gone back to Rome because he wanted to become a Jesuit. And the Jesuits told him no. But at this point, Rosati's in Rome. He sees him and Laus is how he'd make a good coadjutor bishop. And so he gets Kenrick named as his coadjutor. Meanwhile, the Pope is asking Rosati to try to do some diplomatic relationships with something going on in Haiti. Rosati goes to Haiti, takes care of that, goes back to Rome, gets sick, and dies. So Kenrick is bishop before he knows what's going on. Why did we go to Philadelphia? Well, Peter Richard Kenrick was the bishop of St. Louis. And Francis Patrick Kenrick was the bishop of Philadelphia. He was the older, Francis Patrick was. He had come to the United States years before his younger brother. His younger brother stayed home until Mom and Dad died, which they died when they were fairly young. But Peter Richard allowed the Sisters of St. Joseph to go help his brother Francis. Now the story is that Francis Kenrick was visiting Peter Richard in St. Louis and heard about the Sisters of St. Joseph. Peter Richard really loved the Sisters of St. Joseph. So Francis says, you know, that'd be nice if I could have some of them come and work for me. So he goes to Mother Celestine, who's now the superior. She has been appointed to replace Delphine. He goes to Celestine and asks for sisters to come and help him in Philadelphia. She says, I don't think we have enough. We're a little tight here. Well, he'd like to talk to her a little more about it, and they're going to have a council meeting tomorrow. So he spends the night out at Carondelet in order to be able to talk to the council in the morning. And they do promise him sisters. So who goes? Mother St. John Fournier, with some very young sisters. Sister Mary Joseph Clark and Sister Elizabeth Kincaid had just made vows. Now, this is getting to be a pattern, you know. Make vows, go somewhere. So, between this, Mother St. John Fournier had been at the School for Liberated Slaves, and then she took over the orphanage. There was an orphanage, probably the orphanage that the Daughters of Charity left Carondelet to go take over. Well, when the daughters joined, when the Sisters of Charity joined the Daughters of Charity in France, their rule would not allow them to take care of boys. And so they had to leave all of that kind of work. And they asked the Sisters of St. Joseph to take it over. Sisters of St. Joseph became very popular because we could do so many things that other religions couldn't. So, Mother St. John Fournier, Mary Joseph Clark, Elizabeth Kincaid, and Mary Magdalene Weber all take off. They left on April 15th for Philadelphia. They went from St. Louis to Pittsburgh on steamboats on the Mississippi and the Ohio that were having troubles, sometimes with ice, not at that time of the year, but also low water. It took them from April 15th to May 5th to get themselves to Philadelphia. Now, this was an interesting step because in 1840, Philadelphia had 120,000 inhabitants. St. Louis had 77,000, in 1850, excuse me. Now, 77,000 in St. Louis. But in 1840, one decade previous to that, St. Louis had had 16,000. And in 1830, St. Louis had had 5,000. This was growing unbelievably. But Philadelphia was still quite a bit larger. So she says, on the 6th of May, 1847, this is St. John Fournier speaking, after repeated requests from the Bishop of Philadelphia, 4 sisters arrived in Philadelphia to take charge of an orphanage, which for 2 years had been entrusted to ladies and servants who received their salaries and took little care of the orphans, so that we found them covered with vermin and rags. We had to get to work immediately and with courage, even though we were quite disgusted. There were then only 75 children. Imagine the laundry. We now have 400. There were then only 2 houses of Sisters of Charity and ourselves in Philadelphia. Now there are 11 different orders in the city. In the month of June, after our arrival, that's about within a month, Bishop Kenrick asked me to receive several subjects. I didn't want to, but he insisted. The next place we will be going is 1851. Mother St. John Fournier has worked herself to the bone, and she's told she should go back and take a rest. So she comes back to Carondelet and finds her cousin, Mother Celestine, as least as busy and tired as she is, and she's also accepted the petition of a bishop in St. Paul to send sisters. So Fournier says, I'll go. So she goes back. Bishop Cretan has asked for help. Mother St. John, Sister Philomene, Francis Joseph Ivory, and Scholastica Vasquez start the mission in St. Paul, in the cathedral on the bluff. And then just some of what happens after that. The same year we found in Toronto. 2 years later, Wheeling. In 1854, we get our first missionaries from Moutier. In 1854, we also found in Carondelet, which became Buffalo and Rochester. 1856, Philadelphia founds Brooklyn, which became Brentwood. 1857, we go to Oswego, which became Erie. 1860, became Albany. 1860, we go to Erie, and it had only just begun.
Wow.
So, this is how we got our start. Here at Carondelet, starting March 25th, 1836, when we arrived. September 12th, 1836, we come here. And the rest was in the hands of the rest of the Sisters of St. Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you.